So essentially they're saying that with all things equal, being the lipophilicity, right? Let's say everything else is equal, other than the... And then you have the sebum that your skin and other glands typically produce, which can be filled of fatty acids, triglycerides, cholesterol, etc., etc. And what concentration is that sort of topical dutasteride that can actually help us do this? Well, I want you guys to consider some things here, right? Your hair follicles, depending on what stage of growth they're in and whether... Topical delivery of pharmaceuticals is often constrained by a set of well-established biophysical principles. Among these, the 500 Dalton rule, the molecule's lipophilicity as measured by log P, and we'll touch on that later, and Fick's law of diffusion are crucial for understanding how and whether a compound can effectively penetrate the skin. Now, let's take the case of dutasteride, a lipophilic 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, rather a dual 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, used primarily for benign prostatic hyperplasia and, of course, androgenetic alopecia. And we have seen time and time again how dutasteride has been excluded from the discussion on viable topical agents due to its high molecular weight. But is this really an issue? Is this really a justification to exclude this molecule from topical use for androgenetic alopecia cases? I think the answer is no, and I find that the whole thing about, oh, dutasteride can't work because it has a high molecular weight, I don't think that's really rational, or at least completely rational. Now, I've already talked about topical dutasteride in the past and what most of the literature suggests. I'll leave that video in the comments below and also in the description. But in this video, I'm going to be making a case of topical dutasteride actually working and how the molecular weight may be a bit of a barrier, but it's largely overstated. With or without microneedling, I think there is a case for the use of topical dutasteride and it actually working, similar to how topical finasteride works, but potentially being more potent, given the fact that it's a dual 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. So, let's get on with the video. Now, before we start this video, please consider sharing this with a friend, liking the video, and of course, subscribing to the channel. And for additional channel support, become a member for as little as $2 a month. But seriously, try not to skip around too much in this video, because you'll need the full context to understand everything. As always, check out the links in the description below. First, we need to revisit the 500 Dalton rule as explained by Boss and Menardi in their paper titled, quote, "The 500 Dalton rule for the skin penetration of chemical compounds and drugs," unquote, suggests that molecules with a molecular weight greater than 500 Dalton typically demonstrate poor skin permeability. Now, let's take this into account. Dutasteride molecular weight is 528.5 Daltons, which is slightly over this empirical threshold. However, people often mess this part up, and you have to read the entire paper. The 500 Dalton rule is not a rigid cutoff. Boss and Menardi state this in their paper that, quote, "Somewhere around 500 Dalton is the start of a rapid decline in skin absorption due to molecular size," unquote. So essentially they're saying that with all things equal, being the lipophilicity, right? Let's say everything else is equal, other than the molecular weight, as you go past 500 Daltons, the permeability, or the capacity for the molecule to permeate into the skin decreases. It doesn't reach zero suddenly at 500 Dalton, but it declines past 500 Daltons. And then the paper goes on to show drugs with Daltons above 500, like tacrolimus, having a clinical efficacy and application in various skin conditions. Now, tacrolimus has a high Dalton at around 822 Dalton. Now, considering how it's having therapeutic effects on the skin, on the integument, wherever you're applying this topical tacrolimus, that is a clear indication that a molecule with a high Dalton can still have therapeutic benefits. So there must be other factors to consider. And the 500 Dalton rule is just one rule when it comes to a drug's permeability to the skin. Now, this paper is outdated as it doesn't talk about liposomal encapsulation methods, and just for short, liposomes are spherical lipids that encapsulate drugs and can make them more lipophilic in delivery and also dermally available. Which actually leads us to our next point, right? Another important aspect when it comes to drug delivery to the skin or through the skin and the integument, being the skin, hair, nails, and glands, we have to consider lipophilicity. So with that, we need to talk about the concept of log P, because this is a really important parameter. It tells you a lot about how a drug behaves in the body, and more specifically, how it may behave in the skin. So log P stands for the logarithm of the partition coefficient between two liquids. These are octanol and water. And these two solvents are used to mimic the two main environments a drug might encounter. So octanol represents the lipids that your body produces. And these are from the integument sites. So it could be from your skin, hair, nails, and glands. You also have to consider biological membranes, and these are fundamental structures in all cells in the body where you essentially have this barrier that separates the internal environment of a cell from its external environment. And then you have the sebum that your skin and other glands typically produce, which can be filled of fatty acids, triglycerides, cholesterol, etc., etc. And for the water aspect, this represents aqueous environment, so like your blood, your cytosol, and interstitial fluid. So we can use the water in octanol, put it in a separatory funnel, and observe how these solvents separate from each other. Then after that, we can essentially dump a particular drug into this separatory funnel that contains two solvents, the water and the octanol. And as we observe what this drug is doing, we have to see, where will the drug go? If the drug prefers to go into the octanol layer, we can say that this drug is lipophilic, meaning it loves fats and oils, it loves lipids. But if it hangs out in the water layer, we can say that it's hydrophilic. That means the drug is water soluble. Now, the partition coefficient itself is a number, but because those numbers can get large and out of hand, scientists log transform it into base 10. So that's essentially how we get log P. So let's make this practical, right? If we take a compound that has a log P of 1, that means it's 10 times more soluble in octanol than water. A log P of 3 means it's 1,000 times more soluble in octanol. A log P of -1 means it's 10 times more soluble in water than octanol. So what we can gather from this is that a drug with a higher log P number simply means that it's more lipophilic. Now, where does this idea come from? The octanol water partition system was standardized in the 20th century as a reproducible way to estimate a compound's membrane permeability. That's because our cells are surrounded by lipid bilayers, and if a molecule can't cross that oily layer, that lipid layer, right? Kind of like how we discussed before, it's not going anywhere meaningful. So, log P became a proxy for predicting absorption, distribution, and permeability in drug discovery. Now, this metric is embedded into drug design, QSAR models, also known as quantitative structure activity relationship models, and these are computational mathematical models that help reveal relationships between biological activities, as well as the characteristics of chemicals. We can also see log P being used in dermal absorption studies. For example, the ideal log P for transdermal drug delivery is generally considered to be between 1 and 3 because that balance allows for a compound to be both penetrative into the lipid-rich stratum corneum and also move around in aqueous layers underneath. But if something is too lipophilic, like dutasteride, that has a log P of over 5, particularly 5.09, as reported in the FDA's Clinical Pharmacology and Biopharmaceutics review for the new drug application for dutasteride submitted by GlaxoSmithKline in 2001, again, if we have something like this that's too lipophilic, it may partition so strongly into the lipids of the upper skin layers that it gets stuck there. But, and this is key, let's remember this, that's not always a bad thing. Okay, we know that people complain about side effects, and I'm not going to sit here and say side effects don't exist, right? When it comes to sexual issues, You can certainly have that with 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. That doesn't happen to everyone, and the people it does happen to, it tends to go away with time. But there are people that are very sensitive to the point where they can't use these drugs orally. So in the case of topical dutasteride, that strong lipophilicity actually becomes an advantage. Why, you may ask? Well, because it may accumulate in the pilosebaceous unit. And the pilosebaceous unit is essentially the hair follicle and the sebaceous gland along with the erector pili muscle. It's literally the place we're trying to target. And this area is responsible for the production of sebum. So because we want to get the dutasteride to go to the hair follicle, to travel through the follicular route, and then reach the dermal papilla where you have the 5-alpha reductase enzymes that we have to neutralize such that we don't get that paracrine production of DHT and thus protect the hair follicle. We're kind of getting this balance where we're suppressing local DHT as much as we can in a very efficient way, all while limiting systemic exposure. Systemic exposure is always going to happen, but not to a great extent. Because again, according to the log P data, dutasteride is very lipophilic. You want it to hang around in the hair follicle, but you don't want it to go into nearby blood vessels. Because once it gets into those blood vessels, then it may become too systemic, or probably not at all. But with its strong lipophilicity, it's not going to be doing that as often as something like topical finasteride would. So for people who may be even sensitive to topical finasteride, which let's take a step back real quick. Guys, I want you to truly sit down and assess if you are that sensitive to topical finasteride. If you're just saying, oh, I'm not getting morning wood anymore. Dude, you don't know how often your nocturnal erection cycle, is being impacted, or if it's even being impacted at all, right? Just because you're not, waking up every morning with a fucking hard on doesn't mean that you're affecting your ability to, let's not get too graphic here. I'm not going to go down this rant. It's certainly not the video for this. But all I'm saying is just be honest with yourself, right? If you really are having sexual side effects, or if you're having a nocebo effect and you're overly fixated, on this thing going wrong, right? Take a step back and breathe. But if you are sensitive to topical finasteride to the point where it is causing libido issues, then topical dutasteride might be a solution for you for the aforementioned reasons, right? It's going to want to hang around in the scalp rather than going into blood vessels. And just for your viewing pleasures, I want to show this graphic over here. It's from Boltzinger et al. 2012 in their paper titled, quote, Penetration of Drugs Through Skin, a Complex Rate-Controlling Membrane, unquote. And we can see here there are different routes that a drug, when applied to the skin, may possibly travel. First, we have the intracellular route, and this is where drug molecules weave between dead skin cells in the stratum corneum, navigating primarily through lipid areas that surround these cells. So these structures typically involve the stratum corneum, which is the topmost skin layer, and also the lipid matrix that exists between cells. And this sort of route is typically good for small or moderately lipophilic molecules. Then we have the intracellular route, and this is where the drug penetrates through the stratum corneum, directly crossing both lipid and aqueous domains repeatedly. And this route is good for drugs that are amphiphilic. And that essentially means the chemical or drug compound itself can cross both lipid and aqueous barriers because they're both lipophilic and hydrophilic. And finally, the intrafollicular route. And this is where the drug travels down the openings of the hair follicles and into the sebaceous glands, bypassing much of the stratum corneum. Now, we've already mentioned that dutasteride has a high log P, so this is the route that it would probably want to go through, because it wants to reach the hair follicle to go deeper into the hair follicle and make it into the dermal papilla. And the structures that are involved here are the literal hair follicle canal, the sebaceous gland, and the overall pilosebaceous units. Now, this is a great route for large molecules that are also lipophilic, but also for nano or microparticles, like liposomes, for example. And it's also good for things where we have to target the hair follicle. So in this case, we have dutasteride as a prime topical candidate. However, there is one more property that we can use as a guiding principle when it comes to using dutasteride topically, and that is Fick's law. We can use the property of Fick's law to overcome high molecular weight through concentration and gradient manipulation. So what is Fick's first law of diffusion? Well, this law explains how molecules move from an area of high concentration to areas of lower concentration, but it also factors the path in which these molecules have to travel, or the length of that path, rather. So, essentially in our context, the higher the concentration of a drug applied on the skin and the shorter the path it has to travel, the more of it will diffuse into the skin over time. This law can be described by using this particular formula over here. So again, Fick's first law is essentially J equals negative D times the derivative of concentration with respects to distance. So in this formula, J represents the flux, or the rate at which a drug diffuses per unit area per unit time. The negative sign indicates the direction of diffusion from a high concentration to a low concentration, and the D, or the capital D, is the diffusion coefficient, and this is a measure of how easily the molecule moves through the medium, and in this case, that would be the skin. Now, the little d by C over little d by X is the concentration gradient, meaning the change in concentration, so that being little d by C over a specific distance, or the change of that distance being little d by X, and this serves as the driving force of diffusion. So again, that little d means an instantaneous change, or how fast the concentration changes at a specific depth. So when you take that all together, the little d by C over little d by X means the instantaneous rate of change of concentration with respects to distance. So really, it's the slope of the curve at a specific point. So the bigger the diffusion coefficient, the better the drug partitions into the skin, and the higher the concentration gradient, the more flux, also being how much the drug passes through a given area of skin per unit of time, right? The more flux you get, the more of that you get, right? But if the diffusion path is long, that slows things down. So we can use this framework when figuring out how much a topically applied drug like dutasteride can actually make it into deeper layers of the skin, and if it can even make it deep enough to reach the hair follicle, particularly that dermal papilla area, because that's where you have the 5-alpha reductase enzymes in a high quantity that's turning free floating testosterone into DHT. So how do we do that? What concentration is that sort of topical dutasteride that can actually help us do this? Well, I want you guys to consider some things here, right? Your hair follicles, depending on what stage of growth they're in and whether or not they're terminal hair follicles, which are hair follicles that are producing thick hairs, or if they're intermediate, where they're kind of like not thick, but they have some girth to them, or if they're vellus hairs where they're barely pigmented and they're just lightly colored. But between those two factors, that can determine how deep your hair follicles are. During anagen, or the growth phase, which is when the hair follicles are the most active, the follicle can reach its maximum depth often to 4 to 5 millimeters, penetrating well into the dermis and sometimes into the upper subcutaneous fat. Now, when it comes to imaging of the scalp, I would really love if you guys check out the interview that I did with Dr. Wortsman on using high-frequency ultrasound technology to view deeper layers of the skin, and also my video that I did talking about that technology as well as high-resolution MRI. Because with these sorts of technology, we can actually see how deep hair follicles are in different parts of the hair cycle, and also in different hair follicle disorders. But for this particular segment, I want to focus on a particular study titled, quote, Diagnosis and Differential Diagnosis of Tertiary Androgenetic Alopecia with Severe Alopecia Areata Based on High-Resolution MRI, unquote, by Yuji Yi et al., 2023. And this is from Skin Research and Technology, of the Ford series, volume 29, issue 7, published in July of 2023. But basically, in this study, they're using high-resolution MRI to view the scalp of a person that doesn't have androgenetic alopecia, of a person that has androgenetic alopecia, and then finally of somebody that has alopecia areata. And by doing this, we can get an understanding of how deep these hair follicles typically are in all of these disorders. First off, let's focus on the subcutaneous tissue, which typically begins around 3 to 4 millimeter depth and beyond. We have to consider that the hair bulb and the dermal papilla, which are the key therapeutic targets for drugs like topical dutasteride, are located at the base of the follicle and generally lower in the dermis or upper subcutaneous layer, around 4 to 5 millimeter depth during the anagen growth phase. This is why intrafollicular delivery and lipophilic drug properties, like again dutasteroide's high log P, are critical here to ensure diffusion down this depth. Now, if we compare the subcutaneous tissue to the dermis layer, which is about 1.5 to 4 millimeter depth, or the epidermis, which is about 100 micrometers, and also the stratum corneum, which is the outermost layer or the outermost barrier of the skin, this is 10 to 20 micrometers thick. So honestly, when you're comparing all these layers, this is a very long path for dutasteride, or any drug for that matter, to travel through, right? We want to get to that 4 to 5 or 3 to 4 millimeter depth, which if we compare to the stratum corneum, that's around 150 to 500 times deeper. But because we're using that intrafollicular route, that bypasses many of the hurdles posed by traditional transdermal delivery, and it makes that sort of 3 to 5 millimeter path length to the base of the hair follicle far less of an issue, especially when using high concentrations of topical dutasteride. Because unlike the intercellular or the intracellular pathways, which require a drug to diffuse across the tightly packed layers of the stratum corneum and other sort of epidermal layers with the follicular route, this uses the hair follicle and its associated sebaceous glands as a natural shunt or sort of channel that allows for much deeper and more direct access to the dermis. So that is using the high lipophilicity of dutasteride to essentially launch it through and reach the dermal papilla and sebaceous glands. And also we have to consider that these follicular structures can serve as a reservoir, because once a lipophilic drug enters into these areas, it tends to accumulate in the sebum and the surrounding tissue, and this prolongs its local effect. And then you get a higher concentration. As that sort of concentration builds up, that pushes it through the hair follicle. Sorry, I got distracted by my phone. I got a ding. I'm sure you guys heard it. It pushes it through the intrafollicular route, and then eventually it will reach the dermal papilla. So when you combine this pathway with a high concentration formulation of, let's say, 0.15 up to 0.3, maybe 0.4, I'm shooting in the ballpark here, of topical dutasteride, you're essentially increasing the concentration gradient in Fick's law. And this higher concentration gradient leads to a higher diffusion, flux, even if the path length is technically, long. So essentially, the intrafollicular route isn't just a shortcut, but it's also altering the physics of the delivery, because you're no longer dealing with a sort of passive diffusion through a uniform barrier. You're taking advantage of a natural, lipid-rich tunnel lined with structures that favor the retention of your drug. And in this case, that drug is dutasteride. And it makes a relatively long distance, like let's say 5 millimeter depth, practically surmountable, especially with proper formulation. So not too long ago, as I was yapping, I briefly mentioned a range of 0.15% to either 0.3 or 0.4% topical dutasteride concentration. And I'll admit, for the higher end, I'm kind of just being a bit biased, and, I guess higher is better in this case, because if you don't know what the high end is, you can probably throw some percentages out there. Maybe it might be a bit too high, but better safe than sorry, right? But at least at the current moment, there is a clinical trial attempting to assess the efficacy of topical dutasteride at a 0.15% concentration. And this clinical trial took place in 2023, conducted at Hospital Ramón y Cajal in Madrid, Spain. This is a phase 2 randomized triple-blind study that evaluates the safety and, of course, the efficacy of a 0.15% topical dutasteride emulsion applied daily in men with androgenetic alopecia. The formulation was an oil-in-water emulsion with droplet sizes between 150 to 300 nanometers, designed to optimize delivery to the paleosebaceous unit, as the study's documentation states. So the researchers are using some sort of nanoparticle that's lipid in nature to enhance this sort of topical dutasteride formulation, maybe because of Fick's law, right? They probably find that the path to the dermal papilla, being the base of the hair follicle, might be a bit long. Maybe the stratum corneum and other sort of layers still do present a significant challenge, or maybe a moderate challenge to the topical dutasteride, such that they don't want to use too much of the dutasteride, right? They don't want to go to, like, let's say 0.3 or 0.4 or 0.5% concentration. And for that matter, because they probably want to stay at a lower concentration, they would rather modify the lipid nature, the lipid delivery of the dutasteride, such that it can penetrate more efficiently through the stratum corneum into the epidermis, into the dermis, and finally to the subcutaneous tissue. Now, when it comes to the final results of this study, they are still pending publication. The very inclusion, though, of dutasteride at 0.15% in a controlled clinical setting demonstrates some sort of confidence in its viability. And this concentration, combined with an optimized vehicle, likely will achieve some sort of therapeutic threshold in follicular tissues. Because, again, we can look through the literature. We already know that topical finasteride works, right? It's a matter of drug delivery. It's a matter of physics. But so long as the finasteride is able to reach the deeper layers of the tissue, it can get to the dermal papilla, it can neutralize the 5-alpha reductase enzymes there. At least we know with topical finasteride it works. The only question here is, why wouldn't it work with topical dutasteride, right? It's a matter of formulation. It's a matter of drug formulation. Drug formulation, how we're going about delivering this drug, those are the issues when it comes to dutasteride. And to say that we can't achieve it, or not enough is going to the hair follicle, I don't know if that's a good argument. I'm pretty sure if we use a decent concentration of topical dutasteride, you will see some benefits. A high enough concentration, there will be some benefits, and you can sort of strike a localized effect, right? Where you're probably not going to get that much systemic absorption, but you're probably going to get a sort of localized benefit. So if I had to give my opinion, and I'm not a doctor, by the way, okay, I'm not a doctor, guys, but if I had to give my opinion, I would say that somewhere between the ranges of 0.15% upwards to 0.4% appears to be rational. If you want, maybe go ahead and push it to 0.5% topical dutasteride. I'll presume that concentrations within this range could create a sufficiently strong diffusion gradient to drive the drug into the scalp tissue while minimizing systemic absorption. And it would be optional to use liposomal structures and penetration enhancers too. That could also help in this regard. I would only use these sort of liposomal enhancers for lower concentrations of topical dutasteride between this range, so maybe between 0.15 up to, let's say, 0.2, maybe I would start messing around with liposomal structures. If you do go below 0.15, maybe 0.1 or 0.05, maybe in that case, a liposomal delivery or some sort of nanoparticle delivery might be of interest. But if you're just going to like raw dog it, so to speak, using ethanol and propylene glycol or glycerin or whatever, along with dutasteride as the active ingredient, yeah, I would tend to look at the higher end, so the 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 concentrations. I think that could have some sort of benefit. But that part, I will admit, when it comes to sort of figuring out that sort of concentration where this can work consistently, it might be a bit difficult, but it's not impossible. There's no reason to think that it doesn't work. And there certainly needs to be more studies on this. I could say you can microneedle, and apply this topically, but I don't think microneedling would be too conducive. There are some studies, again, that do show it working in conjunction with topical dutasteride, but I'm not a fan of just poking holes into the scalp consistently. Over time, you probably are going to encourage fibroplasia and eventually fibrosis. No matter the depth, you shouldn't be doing this, right? In my opinion, let's stop with the microneedling craze. It's a bit too crazy, I guess you can say. But that's pretty much it. Again, 0.15% to 0.5% topical dutasteride. I'll just leave it there. So that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I am done talking. It is 3:07 a.m. and it is June 20th, 2025, a Friday, and I have work in about 5 hours. But thanks for watching, and a big announcement soon. If you're still here watching this video, a big announcement soon. I will be releasing a product, topical saw palmetto. Can you believe that? No, it's not topical saw palmetto, but it has to do with minoxidil. Can you guess what it is? Anyway, see you later.